everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the Ask Yaritza series. I am so excited to be here today because guess what? I get to talk about data with my special guest, Mercedes Clemons. She's also known as the Hip Story teacher. She's a sixth grade teacher from Arizona. Hey, Mercedes, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm excited.
Me too.
I'm super excited. I know if you haven't checked out Mercedes' educator profile that Flipgrid actually did, it was great. As I was reading it, honestly, I thought about myself as an educator, but she does something that I really love. She centers conversations around students, which goes exactly with today's topic, data. So our viewer question for today is what data can be used about students' knowledge to help plan your lesson? Mercedes, I want to start off with you. What are your suggestions?
Well, I think we can look at data in two ways. First, we know that students are coming armed with prior knowledge from elementary school based on, what our standards are telling us they know. So, we're using that as we move forward. But then we also have the aspect of like our students are armed with technology more than ever now. So when they're not on camera with us, a lot of them are on TikTok or on YouTube. And we really have to center like, what are they getting content wise when we're not there? Because at the end of the day, for me as a history teacher, and I also teach civics, I know my students are getting information overload, especially when it was around election time. And so it's kind of utilizing and understanding what is being fed into their brains and then, probing, asking those questions and seeing like, are they actually understanding that their sources are, great? Are they biased? And then, teaching them how to actually look at the data coming in through their personal time and not just, what I provide them.
So I love what you just mentioned, Mercedes. And it's what we know as informal data, right? So there's two different types of data. You have formal data, which is it's based off of standardized tests or quizzes teachers may give. And then you have informal, which is usually from like classroom discussions or like you mentioned, the use of technology. And I love assessing students through informal data because we get to see who our students are. Like I remember I used to always give a pre-assessment and I would just ask one simple question. As a history teacher, you could probably resonate with this as well. I would just ask, why is it important to study history? Which means I'm not expecting a kid to know anything specific about history. But when I'm reading, I'm checking for if they're making those connections, right? So like you mentioned the election, I'm checking to see if kids really know what's happening around them. So how important do you believe it is to actually teach things that's relevant and that's happening today?
I think it's 100% relevant because, last week you guys were talking about entry points. Where are students entering in that learning process? And if there's no buy-in to them, it's kind of back to like how when we were taught history, where it was kind of like mnemonic devices. We were remembering names, we were remembering dates, and then it left us next year. And we have a whole generation out there going, oh, well, I didn't learn that, or I don't know because I'm not aware. And I really think when you can tie it into their interests or what they're hearing, our students don't, it's a different generation. They're not watching the news with their parents at night. And so they're getting it differently. And I think us as educators, we also have to step back and realize like, they're not the same as we were when we were 13, 14 years old up until 18. And so really kind of diving into those conversations, I think is key because otherwise, like they're not going to necessarily remember. And that's the impact is you want them to be able to become change makers and not just kids that know, what the Senate is. We want them to be interacting with our senators. We want them to be interacting with our Congress women and men.
So you hit the nail on the head, right? Change makers. You had mentioned before that our students are using TikTok. And it made me like laugh inside. I couldn't show it like while we're live, but yes, I giggled because I remember the other day, and I forget this young lady's name, but she did an entire TikTok on the origins of racism. And she discussed race, the differences in the size of our skulls, and how it came to be. And what was so important to me was she used TikTok to speak to the masses, and she did it her own way. And so even with you mentioning, having connections with our congressmen and our congresswomen, and I'm thinking about that TikTok that has so many views, these are other avenues our kids are taking to address the inequities that exist, but also to communicate with the outside world from their homes.
Yes, exactly. And, that kind of drives the lessons that I create, is seeing that. And, I want students to be able to, when they're doing a Flipgrid on voter suppression, I want them to be able to translate that and maybe use it on TikTok if they can post it. Because they're, at the end of the day, they're teaching others and they're making content. And it's so great to see. Like the other day, I saw the amazing AOC. She live streamed with the youth and like was teaching them and talking with them about politics, all while playing video games. And if that's not like one of the best things to come out of 2020, I don't know what is.
And gaming is so important, right? So I know that when I was in high school, and hopefully if some of my teachers are watching, I'm sorry, but I was bored out my mind in some classes because it was just like I knew what to expect. I knew to come in, grab the paper, sit down, complete, and then talk to whoever was near me, right? There was no connection. There was no, okay, now that I've introduced this topic to you, let's do this next. You brought up gaming, and the only thing I could think about is just my physical classroom space where we had AR. So the kids were able to take tours of China, but almost as if they're already in the war, right? So they're shooting and they're hiding, and you would see the kids ducking, all while I'm on the other side of the classroom teaching a lesson. And that's what I feel we should be bringing to the virtual space as well, because it's the only way our kids are going to make connections with the real world. So speaking of virtual classroom space, right, and data, what are some strategies you would like to give teachers for actually assessing student learning in a virtual space?
Definitely. So I've been having this conversation a lot with my coworkers, and I wouldn't call it intersectionality, but taking on Kimberly Crenshaw's work and kind of analyzing that we can't just look at numbers anymore, because this pandemic has brought out to the forefront all of the inequities involved with distance learning, but also the systemic issues that were in person. And so now it's like relationships matter more than ever when looking at that data, because we need to know, why is a student, if they're consistently tardy, maybe it's not that. Maybe there's reasons as to why. Maybe a student cannot log on to these synchronous lessons, but they're completing asynchronous work. And so I think the relationships is key in data. It's no longer just the numbers. And so we need to be able to, when we have our students, engage them in ways that make them feel like they're in the classroom. And like my data, and this may be an unpopular opinion, but when I talk to my students and when my coworkers talk to their students, we've come to realize students don't like breakout rooms. But over the summer, that's what all of these educational people were pushing. And, those are people who may not have experienced distance learning, but my kids have specifically said, like, we don't like distance learning. We don't like these breakout rooms because it's forced, it's not organic. And so we've really had to come up with ways and have them drive the class. They drive our synchronous sessions, and ours are short. They're only 50 minutes, but it's really driven by their conversation. And it's pulling that data of how are we going to get them to show up, and how are we going to get those that show up to engage. And so goes back to the relationship.
So, all right. And I know I'm using the term love a lot, but you have me like going, and everybody knows when I nod my head, that means yes, 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 yes. You mentioned something that was very important to me, especially with the students that I service. You mentioned breakout rooms, right? And I know a few educators who don't work at my school per se, but who just give up because students don't want to be in the breakout rooms. And I'm just like, well, just think about me being on live instruction by myself some days, right? Because my students are working, or realistically speaking, they're sleeping, right? And so I'm
Mhm.
looking at a screen. And so what I've learned as well is I'm not going to do anything in a virtual space that's not authentic or something that I wouldn't thought about at a regular space. And what I mean by that is I feel like I'm innovative enough, right? But sometimes our approaches are just what satisfies us as educators and not our students, which to me
Mhm.
is very important. I had a conversation with my mentor the other day, and I mentioned the achievement gap. And he stopped me and he said, Yaritza, no. No, stop saying there's an achievement gap. There is no achievement gap, because if we look at data, right? If we look at, especially as a history teacher, if we look at that period of civil rights movement, African Americans was actually high in achievement, right? So it's not
Mhm.
that we're unable to do it. It's more of an access gap because we don't have access to the resources. And so, like breakout rooms, right now, everyone's doing it, but what happens when we get back to in person? You can't move a kid from room 302 to the room 304 to room 306. Everyone's going to be in one space. So how are you now going to differentiate why the kids are
Mhm.
there and according to their interests and their specific needs? So I love what you just said.
Yeah. And one thing too that has really started working for me in the online setting is it goes back to like we get pushed all these words asynchronous, synchronous, and we were looking at data and we were not seeing learning happening in an asynchronous environment. Students were not learning. They might have been completing the work to complete it, but then we would go in and we would do pre-tests and assessments, and it wasn't clicking. And so now what we do, we go back to, okay, students, what do you like to listen to? And now they love listening to lo-fi beats. So we give them that class time in the synchronous setting to work. And I'm literally just there playing lo-fi beats over Zoom as I'm going through their documents and answering questions, and they're answering each other's questions in the chat and helping each other. And that kind of brings back that authenticity that we're kind of craving in breakout rooms, but putting it in the whole group environment.
So why do we analyze data, right? So we know we analyze data for three particular reasons. So we want to know what the students know already, right? We want to know what the students should know. So especially for those who are writing their own objectives or are meeting state standards. And then we want to know what could be done to make sure that students know whatever it is that you want them to know, right? And sometimes I think about the importance of what we teach compared to how we teach. I know that when I'm teaching for a standardized test, I'm like drill sergeant Vijalba. I'm like, we gotta know this, and you gotta do this, and you gotta answer 50 questions in 30 minutes. And I get kids to answer the 50 questions in 30 minutes, and I'm so strategic, and I get them to answer about 42 questions because I know right then and there, according to the state, they're above average in answering those multiple choice questions. Now that's out the window. So what's more important? Those connections that kids are making, right? How am I preparing my kids to be citizens in the United States? How am I preparing my students to be more prepared to take care of themselves? Because I have overage and undercredited students. They're adults. When I started teaching, I used to make a joke. I used to say, you guys are all the same age as me because we were all 21. And so now, 11 years later, I have to look at this very different. What changes are we making? How are we analyzing data? Because honestly, when I used to analyze data, it was always because administrators shoved it in my face.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you were in the regions. This is what you did. What are we going to do as a school? That infamous meeting. What are we going to do as a school? And then you find yourself like doing something, and then at the end of the year, it's like, okay, we're going to change this for next year, even though it worked a little bit this year. And so if you had to give teachers any kind of insight on data, what would it be?
I would say use your community. What is your community data? And I don't just mean like the community within your co-teachers and your team teachers. What are teachers at other schools doing within your district, as well as what are teachers within your field doing? And I go back to maybe because I'm a millennial, but Instagram. I feel like I have become a better teacher by using the data of my peers. And as they share their experiences, as they share their lessons, I'm looking at that and I'm comparing it to, okay, well, we taught the same thing, but their students might have gotten a better outcome or vice versa. And it's also being vulnerable with that data and with those experiences. And part of it is we're not being gatekeepers, especially when it comes to what we have out there, and especially when we are putting out resources that involve Indigenous and people of color. It's we shouldn't be having to gatekeep information that is going to make our students change makers and policy makers, because they're going to grow up and they're going to use this information, and we don't want to gatekeep that from them.
So I agree totally with you, Mercedes. But we have a viewer question from Abraham. He asked about the access gap instead of the achievement gap. What I meant about that, when we think about the achievement gap, we look at the difference between how African American or Black and Latino young men and women are doing education wise compared to white kids, right? Mm-hmm. And what studies found is that at some point in history, there was no achievement gap. African Americans and Blacks were able to still be able to produce phenomenal works in science and math and literacy. So this achievement gap that we constantly keep referring to and constantly keep saying that Black kids cannot learn, it's a myth. It's a possibility that we can learn. You just have to give us access to resources, right? So by resources, I mean, don't just give me a laptop and expect me to automatically know how to use that laptop. What else are you giving me besides that laptop? So are you giving me webinars? Welcome to Brooklyn, as you guys can hear the music. Are you giving me webinars? Are you giving me more resources that would increase my skills on how to use that laptop? So when we think about just the access gap, you have to think about per region, how many students are not getting the help that they seek and that they need, right? A lot of states have given out devices, but haven't even asked students if they know how to turn it on, let alone upload a document. So that's what I mean by the access gap.
So, and it's also like an opportunity gap as well, because then we think about, there's 3 pipelines for all of our students. They're either going to go to college, they're going to go to a career and technical school, or they're going to go through the prison pipeline. And it's, what are those opportunities and what are those deficits? And that's more data that needs to be analyzed and looked at. And schools, I think, need to be looking at that more and seeing where are their students going post-graduation and post-matriculation. And when we don't do that, we're not addressing how we're going to make those changes in the future. We're letting those systems continue to build up.
So Mercedes, I am so happy that you mentioned that, because the students that I service, their ages range from 16 to 21. And I say this all the time. I lose a student to either gun violence or the system, right? And what's so sad about it is the school to prison pipeline does exist. It does exist. And I tell folks all the time that, yes, there are white kids going to jail, but not the same numbers as African American and Latino young boys and girls. And even when we look at, who's getting crucified for doing things in school, is the African American and Latino boys and girls. And so we have to just, I guess, acknowledge the fact that these inequities are happening around us, especially in our classrooms. And then think about ways that we can combat it in a way where it doesn't make the child feel like they're isolated or left out, right? Or being put out because they're different, or because they question you in class because you probably spelled Mississippi River wrong, but you probably just don't want to tell them they were right? And so I said that just to say it's very important to be a culturally responsive teacher. It's very important to know your students, and also how every single law is impacting how our students are going to live their lives after the year they graduate high school. So thank you so much for joining me today, Mercedes. This conversation could have lasted for an entire hour, and I would have never looked at the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was good.
Thank you. And guys, please tune into Friday's blog post where I'll be sharing some resources by Mercedes. Thank you so much for tonight. Have a great night.